Hi there, and welcome to Off the Data Provided, an interpersonal communication podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Dr. Marcus C. Shepard. On today's episode, we are going to talk about a book I recently read entitled The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness by Jonathan Haidt. Throughout my discussion of the book, we'll touch on a few key concepts such as play-based childhood, phone-based childhood, real world, virtual world, conformity bias, prestige bias, discovery mode, defend mode, anti-fragile, safetyism, opportunity cost, social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, addiction, agency, as well as communion. So this book, in essence, looks at how phones have rewired, have changed how Gen Z in particular are growing up. So, of course, after our discussion, we will touch on one Ask Dr. Shepard. I know that it is something that a lot of people enjoy, and sometimes I do it and sometimes I don't. But I promise for the new year, we'll have an episode just dedicated to a bunch of Ask Dr. Shepards. And of course, if you would like to submit one, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. So delving into the anxious generation, as I teased before, it's really around how Gen Z is the first generation in our history to go through puberty, to go through adolescence and the maturation process with these smartphones in their pockets, and how it has truly impacted their mental health. And of course, from my perspective of interpersonal communication, has really diminished their skills and abilities. I witness it firsthand in my classes, especially in my interpersonal communication courses, where a lot of students, of course, on the first day of class ask them why they're taking the course. Of course, a bunch of them say it's for a requirement, but every now and then a few of them will say they're actually taking it because they want to acquire these skills. And through reading this book, it's become even clearer to me, even though my own real world experience dealing with these students, is that they unfortunately just aren't gaining these skills as I did growing up as a child, because I grew up before phone-based childhood, as we'll discuss in our analysis of the book. So the author, Jonathan, proposed a view to look at kind of the late 80s as the beginning of this transition from a play-based childhood, which is one that I grew up on. Even though I was born in 89, baby, I still was having a play-based childhood. And there's this shift slowly, but it becomes very stark and obvious to a phone-based childhood in the 2010s. And so a phone-based childhood, as is defined, is essentially includes internet connection, personal electronic devices such as laptops, tablets, any internet-connected video game console, and of course, smartphones. So as someone that kind of straddled these two worlds in essence, I feel as though I was the last generation, and I think the author would argue that as well, as he argues anybody kind of born after 1996, he would include in this Gen Z generation that's growing up in a phone-based childhood. So I was born, of course, several years before that. So I still grew up in a play-based childhood. And so a play-based childhood is one that is, of course, focused on the art of play. I recall going out in the neighborhood, oftentimes unsupervised, and was playing with friends, was playing with neighbors, was playing with my brother. So we transitioned right from this play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood where kids are happy to stay indoors and play online or be on their phones. And I remember growing up as a child, you didn't want to be in the house. You wanted to be outside with your friends. Or if someone had a video game console, it didn't have the online capability. So if you were playing on the video game console, you were playing with friends. My first gaming console was an N64, right? And there were multiplayer games, and the only way you could play multiplayer is if you were with people. But the internet has changed, and especially this phone-based childhood where, okay, sure, you play online. I know I play online, and sometimes I play with friends online, but a lot of times I'm playing against or with strangers online when I play on my Switch. And so we're seeing that people are happier to stay indoors, play online, but during this process, they are losing those social and physical experiences that are needed to develop basic competencies. And so these help, as the author argues, overcome innate childhood fears and prepare them to rely less on their parents. So the central claim that the author makes is that two things kind of emerge. So there's this one overprotection in the real world that kind of emerges in the late 80s, goes into the 90s, right? I grew up in the stranger danger, so you don't really engage with people that you don't know. But on the flip side, there's this underprotection in the virtual world. And so what actually exists when you give a child a smartphone, they have access to almost anything. Usually most kids are smarter than their parents when it comes to phones and child protection, and they can remove them, or they know how to do a quick Google search on how to enable or disable certain things on phones that maybe their parents have done, or even browsers. And so this is why the author argues that children born specifically after 1995 became this real anxious generation because they're living more so in a virtual world, which doesn't cultivate these skills, versus the real world, which I knew I grew up in. And maybe some of my listeners, right, if you're around my age or older, you grew up in that as well. And so an important distinction to make here, right, is the real world versus the virtual world. And what does that mean? So the real world is embodied, right? We use our bodies as communication devices, right? We're conscious of others, and we respond to the bodies of others both consciously and unconsciously, right? This is verbal and nonverbal communication. So the nonverbal, what is your body movement doing? Eye contact, facial gestures, tone, rate, pitch of your voice. We also know real world is synchronous, so it's happening at the same time with subtle cues about timing and turn taking. So if I'm talking, as I'm talking now, usually we know it's impolite to interrupt somebody until they finish their point. Then we let them finish their point, and now it's my turn. Or maybe you do interrupt and say, excuse me, I want to say something, right? We also know in the real world that it's primarily one-to-one communication or one-to-several, with really only one interaction usually happening at a time. And we know that real world, it kind of takes place in communities with usually a high bar for entry and exit. So people are strongly motivated to invest in relationships and repair rifts when they occur because they have fostered these connections in the quote unquote real world. And we know that it takes a bigger bar to enter and create those connections and to leave them. On the flip side, we know that the virtual world is disembodied. So you don't really need a body, you just need language. And as we're seeing with the rise of usages of AI and bots, a lot of times maybe when you're on these actual sites, if you respond to somebody who responds to you, sometimes it's a bot, sometimes it's AI generated. We also know that it's heavily asynchronous, so it's text-based posts and comments that can be happening, right? I can tweet something out and someone can respond to it hours or days later or months later if they so choose. It happens often to me and I'm sure others. We also know that it's a substantial number of one-to-many communications. So we're broadcasting to vast audiences, and there are multiple interactions occurring in parallel and in tandem at the same time. So I might tweet something, right, when I've had quote-unquote viral moments before I guess the algorithm maybe changed, even though I still do have them from time to time. But when I had them more frequently, right, there would be people quote tweeting tweets that I did, responding to those tweets, DMing me, right, all at the same time, simultaneously. And we also know in the virtual world that communities have a low bar of entry and exit. So people can block other people or just quit when they're not pleased. So communities tend to be short lived and relationships are often felt as disposable. So there's not that high bar of entry or exit in the real world, right? If I, in the real world, am on a team, let's say I do a recreational league, well, it's a high bar. I've had to commit to a certain time to show up to do this activity. I have to maybe go to practices as well, go to the games, right? This is a high bar of entry, and maybe I've paid money to join this league, and maybe even a high bar of exit. If I've paid a lot of money, if I've invested, I've fostered these relationships, it's going to be harder for me to leave versus a low bar of entry. Maybe I am a mutual with somebody. They've said something that has offended me, and I just decide to block them or unfollow them in just a quick tap of my phone. Not much of an investment there. And as people are growing up more and more in the virtual world, their communities are shorter lived. Their relationships are felt as more disposable. But what is interesting or fascinating, as Jonathan argues in the anxious generation, is that there are strengths in Gen Z, and I see and believe in these as someone who teaches a lot of Gen Z students. Is one, they're not in denial about what exists. They're aware of it, they're willing to discuss and engage with it. I think that's great. Another thing is they want to get healthier and stronger. So I point oftentimes to students who take my classes because they want to get these skills that they realize that they lack. They're also open to new ways of interacting, which I think is really important. And lastly, they want to bring about systemic change. They know that what is happening is not necessarily ideal, and they want to change it. They just oftentimes don't know how to or what steps to take. So a book like this or different classes that offer them different skills can help them make those changes. And I know personally, as a professor of interpersonal communication, and I have, repeat offenders, as my mentor would call them, and I call them as well, students who take multiple classes that I teach across. I've seen changes in my students who've taken my interpersonal communication class, who then might take my public speaking class or my rhetoric in the public sphere class. They're different, and they are changing, and they're making these adjustments in real time, which I think is a great thing to witness. And so ultimately, right, I don't want to give away his entire book, right? But Foundations for Healthier Childhood in the Digital Age, he argues for multiple things. One is that there should be no smartphones before high school, no social media before 16. There should be phone-free schools. We should have far more unsupervised play and childhood independence. And of course, we'll wrap and get into that towards the end of our discussion. But those are just 4 foundational behavior changes that he argues. There are, of course, a lot more, but I think those are kind of the tangible ones that we will discuss a little deeper in our discussion. So getting back to kind of the no smartphones before high school, I know, for instance, raising my hand virtually, I didn't have a smartphone. Even when I was in high school, kind of the phone I had was a flip phone. And basic phones were really great for communicating directly one-on-one with people. So back in my day, it wasn't free to text until after 6, or you could text people who were on your same phone plan for free, or you had a certain amount of free text. So texting wasn't as it is now, where it's almost seen as a synchronous form of communication, though it is still asynchronous, right? In my viewpoint, in my mind, if something is urgent, you call somebody still. That might be a generational shift or change, where texting, sure, sometimes I respond immediately to text and I try to do my best to respond as quickly as possible. But to me, if something is urgent, you're not going to text it to me, right? I could be inundated with a bunch of texts, you're going to call. So basic phones back when I was growing up, right before this shift and this creation of the anxious generation, our cell phones were used more so to set up plans to hang out outside of school, to maybe ask about homework, to maybe continue discussions, right? We might talk on the phone, but it always was cycling back to in-person communication. And so we know that people are likely to become more depressed and feel more socially disconnected and less interested and able to seek out connections when they're stuck in this unfortunate cycle that is the phone-based childhood that we're finding are unfortunate my students, right? Maybe your brothers, sisters, maybe even you as a listener in, right? You're more likely to become depressed and feel disconnected and stay depressed and stuck in this loop cycle. And we'll talk about why you feel that through our analysis of this work. But that shows up, right? If we pay close attention to friendships and social relationships, we see that play-based childhood, though, strengthens them, while a phone-based childhood, of course, weakens them. So as I shared, right, my phone was used to usually set up play dates outside of school, or are we going to hang out after school? You're going to come to my place, or I'm going to go to your place. We'll do homework at your place, my place. That was what it was in high school for myself, where we know that smartphones operate very differently. They connect you to the internet 24/7. You can have 101 apps running simultaneously. You quickly become kind of honed into your social media platforms as you're continually pinged throughout your day with notifications to check in on what someone has responded or said or somebody posted. And so this kind of connectivity offers very few benefits. I would say maybe it doesn't offer any at all. It kind of gives you this false sense of connection. And I view it somewhat as fast food, right? Fast food, I enjoy fast food every now and then, but it ultimately doesn't usually give you the necessary nutrients that you need to survive and thrive. And so, yes, social media can help to maybe maintain relationships, as we've talked about on earlier episodes. I even created my own concept, amienships, which is this new form of platonic relationship that emerges where you become more of a voyeur of your friends' lives than an active participant. I know I'm guilty and have amiens. I know other people do as well. I always, in my classes every semester, ask students to kind of look at their social media. We talk about it. And the majority of people all admit to having some type of amiens because these smartphones keep you in that connection, right? I feel connected to you even though I'm not talking to you directly. I'm observing your life. And so Sherry Tuckle of MIT calls this that we're forever elsewhere, right? This profound transformation of our consciousness and relationships that occurs really starts in about 2010 and moves to 2015. And the reason 2010 is the beginning of it is that's when the iPhone 4 was introduced. This had the front-facing camera, as well as the Samsung Galaxy S was introduced. X was introduced in the same year, I believe about a month apart, also had a front-facing camera, and Instagram also launched as a smartphone-only app at that time, and I believe it was only available for iPhones at first, and then it moved to Android platforms. So with these smartphones, right, there's so much new and exciting virtual activities, but we've lost the ability then to be fully present with the people around us. And so we have viewed a changing social life for everyone, even those that don't necessarily use these platforms. So I remember in the early 2010s, right? I was at the end of college, beginning of grad school, and I wasn't necessarily as tethered to my phone as I am now because I didn't grow up with all of this social media platforms. And we see even how we use these social media platforms has shifted, and the book talks a little bit about that. But perfect instance, I have a Facebook account. I'm not on Facebook though, but I remember you would go out with friends with your digital camera, right? Not even your smartphone, right? Your digital camera. You would take a bunch of pictures. You'd put the SD card into your computer, right? Our computers no longer have those, but you would put it in and you would just upload all the photos and you would just tag all your friends. It could be great pictures. It could be bad pictures, right? But it was just highlighting what you all had done. Right? Now, as we are aware of, it's very curated. And this, unfortunately, is really impacting children. And we'll talk about that briefly. But the great rewiring of childhood, which is literally somewhat in the title, is actually in the title of this book, refers to a period between 2010 and 2015. And this is where social patterns, role models, emotions, physical activity, and even sleep patterns were fundamentally changed for adolescents in just those 5 years. So what we do view from the data, and this book does a really great delve into the data. So I would recommend purchasing this book. Totally enjoyed it. If not purchasing it, renting it from your library. Libraries are great resources. Shout out to them. My first job was at a library. Is that after staying relatively flat from 2000 to 2012, reports of feeling lonely and friendlessness at schools increase in all regions except for Asia. And so what's fascinating is that life on the platforms force young people to become their own brand managers. So they're always thinking ahead about social consequences for each photo, video comments, and emojis they choose. So they are vastly aware that they're creating a digital footprint and that what they post, what they say, what they engage in could last forever. So this, of course, is a bit unfortunate because now, given the vast majority of time invested in these asynchronous interactions, we are more focused on how we appear, how we seem, than actually being. And so rather than getting together with friends, we are posting cute pictures of ourselves, or we are talking to people on social media. And so people wonder why so many teens find themselves lonely and starve for connection. Well, it's because they can't, if I'm on my phone, I can't fully be present to foster these connections. And this is where we have conformity bias and prestige bias seep into our conversations. So, of course, conformity bias is oftentimes where the value is obvious. Doing whatever most people are doing is usually the safest strategy across a wide range of environments. So it can be particularly valuable when you're a newcomer in an existing society, that you kind of do what people do or do what they want. I think Mean Girls is kind of a famous movie that highlights this conformity bias in a sense. If you've seen the movie, I think it was 2004, and then they did a remake of it, kind of a musical updated version in 2024, I believe, potentially. My dates could be wrong. Don't hold me to the cross. But essentially, the lead character, Katie, joins the school and she conforms to the popular girls, and they have strict rules, and so she does that. What's interesting about conformity bias is when it comes to social media, you can scroll through thousands of data points within an hour, and each has this numerical evidence, likes, retweets, engagements, comments, views, that shows whether a post is a success or a failure. And therefore, as a young, impressionable individual, you are going to more likely try and conform to what has gotten the most likes, retweets, engagements, comments, views. And even as adults, I'm sure some of us are guilty of that as well. Oh, this picture did really, really well. Let me try and recreate this same picture. I know I've done it before, right? But I'm more fully formed and can admit and be aware of that. And my identity isn't necessarily wrapped up in that. And also when a photo, quote unquote, flops, I don't take it personally, right? My self-worth isn't as invested in that. Where maybe for a young individual, it is, right? Social media is probably the most efficient conformity engine ever invented. Within an hour, I can see 1,000+ posts that show me what hits, what works, what doesn't. And I can maybe start to change my personality, change my identity to fit into what I believe I should be doing. And I think that also brings me, right, I always tie in COVID because I am COVID aware, COVID conscious, or air aware, whatever you want to call it. And it's not popular to wear a mask. It is not popular to talk about COVID. And yet I still do. I don't feel that conformity bias there. On the flip side, with prestige bias, right, this is oftentimes where you follow people who are successful or who are doing things that you want to do and hope to emulate that to get their success. So on social media platforms, kind of this link between excellence and prestige has become far more easily harmed than ever. So people are oftentimes following influencers who become famous for what they do in the virtual world. And young people are learning of ways of talking, behaving, and emoting that may actually backfire in the real world, in the office, in their family, in interpersonal communication settings. So being aware and mindful of that as an adult, you can see that, okay, this person is doing this and it's eliciting a lot of engagement, but this isn't something I should probably do in the real world. Well, I know that because I've grown up in the real world, right? I had a play-based childhood. I didn't have a phone-based childhood, but my childhood is phone-based and I'm learning from what I'm seeing. I may think that some of these behaviors are appropriate when they aren't. And so we know that social media is moving adolescents away from finding mentors and role models, and it is pushing them instead to turn to influencers and turn into followers and following trends that may not actually be who they truly are. So the data that the book pulls from shows that Gen Z girls seem to be following a small number of women whose main excellence or prestige seems to be just from amassing followers to influence. And Gen Z boys are social learning from popular male influencers who offer visions of masculinity that are often extreme and potentially inapplicable to their daily lives. So I think about that toxic masculinity when I see these clips of podcasts, right? Sometimes my students have brought them in to courses to talk about people, right? Andrew Tate, I believe, is one of the people I remember a student wanted to do a speech on. They're learning ideas from people who are spewing very extreme, often harmful things, but they don't see or understand that because their only worldview is the virtual world where they're seeing it. And they're seeing, oh, this video has 500,000 views. It has millions of engagement. Okay, this must be something worth my time, worth seeing. They don't have necessarily the real world understanding that this isn't maybe what you want to do. And so as we see, right, this is that phone-based childhood. So children learn, we know, through play, to connect, to synchronize, to take turns. They enjoy attunement. They need enormous quantities of it. Attunement is usually through synchrony. It helps bond us with communities. And social media, unfortunately, in contrast, is asynchronous. It's performative. It inhibits attunement, and it leaves heavy users starved for social connection. So sure, I've been on my phone for hours and I've been engaging with people for hours, but I don't feel that bond. So in this new phone-based childhood, free play, attunement, and other modes of social learning are replaced by screen time, asynchronous interactions, and influencers who are chosen by algorithms. So children, at the end of the day, are deprived of childhood. If I think about the childhood I had, it was going outside. I lived in the suburbs for my childhood, right? It was going outside. It was climbing trees when I lived in Wisconsin. It was walking trails. It was going to the tennis court. I couldn't play tennis, right? But the people I was with, right, they were hitting the ball back and forth. It was running around. It was playing tag. It was doing all of these things, oftentimes unsupervised. And that doesn't exist anymore. And so we know that children with a healthy childhood have a lot of autonomy, as I definitely had, have unsupervised play in the real world. And this sets their brains to discover mode. And with discover mode, this helps develop a healthy attachment system and ability to handle risk in their daily lives. So discover mode is known where you scan for opportunities, you think of yourselves. It's kind of like a kid in a candy shop mentality. You're excited to be there. You're looking for different opportunities for engagement, to explore, to learn new things. And it's this let me grow mentality. Let me go. Let me try these things. We see this oftentimes with toddlers, right? When they're just roaming around, they're touching everything, they want to play, right? That's discover mode. Conversely, though, when we have these pressures on parents to adapt to more overprotective parenting, it sets the child's brain more so to defend mode. So this is where they maybe have less secure attachments, and it reduces their ability to evaluate and handle risk. So in this defend mode, kids are more anxious, they're defensive, they tend to see new situations, people, and ideas as potential threats instead of opportunities to learn. So they scan for dangers, they have a scarcity mindset, they cling to their parents or to their team. They're looking for people to keep them safe. And they're likely, unfortunately, to learn less, have fewer close friends, be more anxious, experience more pain from just ordinary conversations and conflict. So I know growing up, I was in discover mode and was encouraged to be in discover mode, right? My parents would kind of supervise sometimes, but wouldn't as well. Like my mom would be home, but she'd be in a totally different room and I'd be hanging out and playing with friends. She wasn't being a quote unquote helicopter parent, always looking out, always making sure I was safe, that nothing would happen to me. And so this is where we have this anti-fragile concept. So anti-fragile are things that actually need to get knocked over now and then in order to become strong. And kids are anti-fragile, right? So we want to keep them as safe as necessary, but not as possible. But in a phone-based childhood, there are few indications of development of anti-fragility because they're just on their phone. They're not actually experiencing the quote-unquote real world. They're not putting themselves into any quote-unquote danger, nor are we as a society welcoming that. So we know that for social development, they need to learn the art of friendship, which is embodied. It's not disembodied, which is the virtual world. It's embodied. It's in the real world. Friends do things together. And as children, they hang out, they hug, they wrestle, they get upset at each other. They usually, maybe have minor fights. But mistakes are low cost and they can be rectified in real time. So maybe I wanted to play with this toy, but you also wanted to play with this toy. So we had a push and pull match, and then you hit me, and then I started to cry. And then maybe you apologize, and we figured out a way to share the toy, right? We learned in real time. We didn't need a parent to step in and figure that out. So it's clear that embodied signals of this rectification, such as an apology with an appropriate facial expression, might occur, right? Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I didn't mean to. Let's figure it out. Let's work it through. Or maybe a parent hears somebody crying right now. They come in and they might intervene and help you maybe learn the social skills. Hey, if you both want to play with that toy, next time, maybe someone can play with it first for a few minutes and then the other person can play with it. Or maybe we can find a similar toy and you both can play and then swap and play, right? But if you're just disembodied and you're just online and you're on a screen and you're just touching things, you're just playing a mobile game the whole time, you're not learning any of these skills. So young people are moving their social relationships, of course, online, and those relationships become disembodied. They're asynchronous and they're somewhat disposable, right? There's that low bar of entry and exit. So even small mistakes can bring heavy costs in the virtual world where content can live forever. Everybody can see it. So mistakes can be met with intense criticism by people and they don't have any connection with you. Apologies can be mocked, and reacceptance can be mixed or vague. And instead of gaining social experience, children are often left with a sense of social incompetence, loss of status, anxiety about even future social interactions online. So I know, for instance, I had one post go super viral that even it moved its way to Facebook, and my cousin sent it to me. And it was in essence I've talked about it before on this podcast, but someone that I was fostering I thought an offline friendship with from social media had kind of gone ghost. We had known each other only a few weeks, I'd say 7 weeks. And of that 7 weeks, 3 of those weeks we hadn't corresponded. So I said, oh, okay, it's kind of the friendship, I guess, died off, right? Weak bonds, as we talk about, right? It was a relationship from the virtual world. It wasn't in the real world. So there weren't strong ties. Low bar to enter, low bar to exit. So he didn't respond to my message and I just left it at that. Okay, he didn't respond to me asking how his day was. It's been 3 weeks, whatever. Kind of move on, right? I wasn't as invested in it because it was virtual. Hits me with a message saying, oh, I know I haven't talked to you in a while, but I'm going through a hard time. Can you give me some words of wisdom? You're always great with that. And I said, I said, those people you were engaging with for the last 3 weeks, ask them, right? Those people seem to be more important to your social well-being. Don't come to me, right? In essence, don't make me your fat friend, right? Is the term and the trope that I use and that was applicable, right? You're not interested in maintaining or fostering a relationship with me. You just want me to provide you with benefits, right? Kind of the mammification of a relationship, right? What can I offer? How can I serve you? But you're not interested in pouring anything into me. That, put that tweet out. Right, showed a screenshot of my response to encourage people to kind of reject those type of one-sided engagements or relationships. And it went viral, right? And for the first probably 24 hours, people got it, right? They understood it. And then it switched, as usually anything on social media does. If you've been on social media long enough, you can say, I love pancakes. And someone will be like, well, what about waffles? Oh, why do you hate waffles? You despise French toast. Well, that's not what you said, right? But of course, that's social media, right? So it got flipped. There was intense criticism. People were calling me out my name. Essentially, some people were threatening that I should kill myself, all this stuff. But I'm a fully formed grown adult, so it didn't hurt me at all. I remember one friend called me because it was becoming such a big thing. I was like, oh, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, I kind of stopped engaging with it. I muted it. Once I saw it kind of totally turned, I said, those that got it, got it. Those that didn't, it is what it is. It doesn't speak to them. As professor of rhetoric, right, I know there's no universal message. So you could say, for instance, I always talk to my students about with universal messaging, you would think that free college would be something that people would love. But there are some people like, no, I should pay for college. I need to work hard and earn my keep. Okay, right? So there's nothing that is going to be a universal message that anybody agrees with. And being an adult, you hopefully understand that. But as a child, you don't. And so engaging, I couldn't imagine if I posted this as a child and I was still forming my identity, to see tens of thousands of negative messages to me would really cause me a lot of anxiety. It would cause me maybe some depression. It might make me turn into a hermit. And unfortunately, we've thrown kids onto the internet, and this is what they're engaging with. And then on the flip side, right, as the crux is of this book, as the author stated literally in the first few pages, was the underprotection in the virtual world, which we've just underscored, and then on the flip side, the overprotection in the real world. And this is where we get into the idea of safetyism. And this is where safety trumps everything else, no matter how unlikely or trivial the potential danger is. And this is an experience blocker. So we know that in the 1980s and especially in the 90s, and as a child that grew up in the 90s, right, parents in especially Anglo countries, the author argues, became more fearful for many reasons, including the change in news cycles, the media ecosystem, and they lost trust in one another and started spending far more time supervising their children than they did parenting. And so their parenting shifted from discover mode to defend mode. And so they were seeking risk, and they were seeing risk and threat everywhere for their children. And so trying to be a good parent and their parenting, I flipped to defend mode. I want to make sure my children avoid these experiences that could harm them. And so unfortunately, this started a decline, but it really wasn't until the addition of the second experience blocker, which is the smartphone, that we saw drastic rates of mental health issues increase for boys and girls. So when we think about that, right, safetyism, this stranger danger, don't talk to adults, what happens during this is people are seen as predators or creeps. And even I see this now as kind of an adult. I don't engage with children, right? I'll be on the bus and I'll see kids and maybe they're acting up a little bit, but I mind my business. Where I do remember as a child growing up that sometimes if I was out at the mall with friends and we were kind of maybe doing some things that maybe we shouldn't do or maybe weren't as respectful, an adult would feel and would be within their right to say, hey, y'all shouldn't be doing that. And we would mind that and we wouldn't do that. Where now people usually just don't say anything, right? And they allow kids to kind of exist if they even do exist, where most times when kids are out there, they're just on their phone, right? So we know communicating by text supplemented by emojis is not going to develop the part of the brain that are expecting to get turned up during conversations that are supplemented by those nonverbals. So those facial expressions, those changing of vocal tones, the direct eye contact, that body language. And so ultimately, we can't expect children and adolescents to develop into adult-level real-world social skills when their social interactions are happening largely on the virtual world and are confined to social media platforms. So I bring up this communicating by text supplemented by emojis, right? And that is not how the majority of people communicate in the real world. And it's fascinating and interesting when I engage with students, right, that a lot of them don't have these skills. And it's clear why, especially reading this book, it really underscores, well, where would they have picked up those skills? Where I picked up those skills on the playground during recess, and we know that recess is being cut, free play is being cut. Well, where are they supposed to learn these skills? These age-appropriate skills? Online, where they're oftentimes interacting with adults? I don't think so, right? So we're seeing that, right? We can't expect them to develop these adult-level real-world social skills if they're largely interacting just in the virtual world. And what works in the virtual world doesn't oftentimes work in the real world. And so social media, right, is causing these opportunity costs. Right? The opportunity cost of phone-based childhood is really broken down into 4 aspects. So it's social deprivation, as we've kind of been talking about and around. It's sleep deprivation, it's attention fragmentation, and it's also addiction. So social deprivation, one quote that I really want to nail that I wrote down because I thought it was fascinating, especially as someone that takes COVID seriously, it says, in 2020, we began telling everyone to avoid proximity to any person outside of their quote-unquote bubble. But members of Gen Z began social distancing themselves as soon as they got their first smartphones. I think this is super important because especially when we talk about mental health crisis, a lot of people want to point to the quote-unquote COVID lockdowns, which, if we're being honest, only existed for a few months, even if people followed those, right? Strong if. But that did not create a seismic generational shift, right? It's really been the smartphones. And this book does a really great job underscoring that, right? We've deprived ourselves of being fully present with people. I remember a time when I was in LA for grad school, and one of my friends, his boyfriend, would purposely leave his phone at home. So when he was out and about, he could be fully present and engaged. And this was even before the social media networks became really what they were. But he was ahead of the curve. And I know even during that time period, some people would do the game of, we'd all put our phones in the center of the table, and whoever reached for their phone first would have to pay the bill, right? Or do something, right? We were aware that they were removing us from being present. And yet in 2025, we're about to be in 2026 in a few weeks, knock on wood, we see that it's common. And I'm guilty of it sometimes. I try and be mindful of it. But if I'm talking to someone, I hope my phone is not in my hand, right? I try and put it away. And if you've ever been to my house and I'm hosting something, oftentimes I don't know where my phone is, right? And I'm getting, notifications on my watch, right? And then I'll try and find it. Or if you've ever stayed with me for a bit, right, you'll hear me hit my Apple Watch and try and ping my phone often, because when I'm fully present with people, I'm not mindful of where my phone is or what's happening on my phone. So as someone that straddles, right, who's young millennial, I guess, not Gen Z whatsoever, but we're mindful and we're aware of social deprivation, that these phones, even when we're in real world situations, are sometimes making us not as present. Sleep deprivation, right? We need sleep, and lack of sleep will impact on depression, anxiety, irritability, cognitive deficits, poor learning behaviors. This has all been studied. We know also that it has aspects of attention fragmentation, which also relates to social deprivation in my mind, where attention fragmentation is essentially our ability to stay on one mental road while there are many off-ramps. Well, with a phone that you get pinged multiple times a day, if you're focused on doing one thing, then you get a ping, then you might get sidetracked, and now you're on the social media app for 20 minutes when you just went on your phone to check something, right? Well, how did I get here, right? These phones are designed to pull our attention, to keep us on these apps as much as possible. Whenever I post on Instagram, for instance, right, my phone will ping, 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 ping. And oftentimes like, oh, let me see. Oh, well, how's the post doing? How many likes does it have? Oh, let me check the metrics. Oh, is it doing as well as my last one, right? My attention being fragmented from what I originally did. But there were times before where I would just post and go about my day, right? I wouldn't know what was happening. But a lot of us have opted into these notifications. And then, of course, addiction, right? How can we hook people to become heavy users of our products? And oftentimes it's through this dopamine release. And so a dopamine release is pleasurable, but it does not trigger a feeling of satisfaction. Rather, it makes you want more of whatever you did to trigger that release. And so you want to keep doing those things. So let's say I posted very well on Instagram. Okay, I'm going to post again. I'm going to post maybe the same type of photo or around the same time or wear the similar outfit and see if it does. Okay, it did just as well, or maybe it did a little better. Okay, let me do it again. We see this sometimes with people on social media, right? Where the clothes start getting maybe more risque or less clothes, right? And the more likes go up and the more likes go up and the more likes go up, right? This dopamine release. I'm addicted to getting these likes, to getting these followers. Who knows? And so teens are certainly right, though, when they say that social media gives them connections to their friends. But as we've seen through clearly a bunch of studies, there's still increased loneliness and isolation. And these connections do not seem to be as good as what it replaced. And what it replaced was being present, right? So I see shifts, right? In relationships, kind of newer relationships I've made since kind of the dawn of social media, maybe aren't as strong or as tied as those maybe that I made before, because I was more present with those people and I still am very present with those people. It's kind of been established. And two other concepts that come into play, of course, are agency and communion. And so agency is striving to individuate and expand the self and involves qualities such as efficiency, competence, and assertiveness. And we know that boys and men seem to be more focused on agency. And this is what attracts them to different social media content. And then communion arises from striving to integrate the self in a larger social unit through a caring of others and involves qualities such as benevolence, cooperativeness, and empathy. And we know that girls and women are more focused on this and therefore informs their social media uses. So social media, right, is commonly used by teens today, usually increases the quantity of connections, but thereby reduces the quality of these connections. And so we can see that, unfortunately, you have maybe more friends or more connections, more ties, but they're weaker. They're not as strong. They're not as invested as others. And so clinical psychologist Lisa Daymore says that the quality always trumps quantity. And I'm a believer of this, right? As someone, I was never super popular. I always had friends, right? But I was usually happier than some of my more popular friends because I had stronger connections with the friends that I did have. And so Lisa Daymore says the happiest girls aren't the ones that have the most friendships, but the ones that have strong, supportive friendships, if that means having a single terrific friend. And she also notes that it's the same for boys. So what is it about, why do I want to amass so many followers? These quantity doesn't equal quality at all. And you might feel even more lonely. You might feel disconnected. You might be unsatisfied. Okay, I have 10,000 followers, but I'm going through maybe a breakup. Who can I call? Who can I talk to? ... Right? Maybe you don't have anybody you can talk to, and that's unfortunate. And so we know that on a phone-based life, generally pulls people downwards. It changes the way they think, feel, judge, and relate to others. And phone-based lifestyles affect how people spiritually connect by blocking these 6 spiritual practices that are discussed. So one is shared sacredness, embodiment, and stillness, silence and focus, self-transcendence, being slow to anger, yet quick to forgive, and lastly, finding awe in nature. So we know that social media keeps the focus clearly on self and self-preservation. It's about branding. It's about social standing. So it's almost perfectly designed to prevent self-transcendence, right? You are focused on putting your best foot forward, curating a brand. How can you focus on stillness and focus if your phone is always going off, if you're always checking your notifications? How can you be slow to anger and quick to forgive when social media is primed us to be quick to respond, quick to drop a witty critique. For instance, the post I shared with you earlier, right? A lot of people were quoting it and saying kind of nasty things, or, oh, like, this isn't right, like, da 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 da. And I would respond to some of them, right? And be like, oh, well, for clarity, here's a little more information. They're like, oh, okay, you're 100% right. Never mind. But would never delete the criticism that they made. Well, why is it still up? Right? You were quick to anger, slow to quote unquote forgive, even though we're not in community with each other. And so, unfortunately, these phone-based lives and childhoods that these people are creating, you're not fostering community at all. You're fostering a network. And a network and a community are two different things. And the book, of course, offers some really amazing suggestions, as I teased some of them before and we'll revisit, is that one, we shouldn't have smartphones before high school. And I agree with this. I think I didn't have a smartphone before high school. I had a flip phone and I could text, right? So I can text, you can call people. What else do you really need as a child, right? I don't need to use these things. He also argues that we should have no social media before the age of 16. And I agree with that as well. The original bill that kind of created the internet safety where you're supposed to be 13 or older, the original age was 16. And that was backed by studies about brain development and social skill development. But the bill, they kind of negotiated to 13. So if the 13 was just a random number, but 16 was actually fostered because of studies, we should do that. Also argues for phone-free schools as someone that teaches in a school. I think that is a great idea. I think it's something that some schools have done, as was highlighted in the book, and can work, of course, when it comes to school shootings, right, that exists. Unfortunately, I think, then it's like, well, how are we supposed to communicate with our children? How are we supposed to know where they are there, right? So I think phone-free schools is something that should be worked towards. It talks about pouches that could be created that you need to put a code in or something that could be provided to students. I think that is also interesting and something to explore. And then, of course, far more unsupervised play and childhood independence. If you talk to anybody who grew up before 1990s, 2000s, right? If you talk to them about their childhood and their experiences, they'll have a lot of vivid memories about unsupervised play and having a lot of independence. If you talk to students, or I'm saying students, but kids or children or young adults now, right, who were born after 1995, right, who are about 20 now, so young adults even, they don't have a lot of unsupervised play or childhood independence in the way that we did, right? They've grown up in a more supervised surveillance state. They've grown up in a lot of, as we talked about before, not a childhood that is on discover mode, but on defend mode. And so we want to get them back to that. So I think the book does a really great job of outlining kind of where we've went wrong with this great rewiring with the introduction of smartphones and a phone-based, childhood versus a play-based childhood, and that we need to get back to a play-based childhood for these children, and that this will hopefully help solve a lot of these mental health, anxiety, depression issues. So that is kind of the book in a nutshell. I really enjoyed it. Once again, it's called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. I highly recommend it for anybody that has children, who's interested in having children, who works with children, who just cares about this shifting in social skills and psychology that we're witnessing. And as someone that studies interpersonal communication, I think it does a great job of highlighting how these children and now young adults have just missed opportunities that could provide them with the ability to foster these social skills. So that's where we'll leave our discussion for today. Of course, we will move into our Ask Dr. Shepard. This has been a long episode, so I'm just going to do a really short one that I received. As always, if you want to submit an Ask Dr. Shepard, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. That is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. So the Ask Dr. Shepard for this week comes from, I guess, a follower from social media who has listened to the podcast. So thank you so much for tuning in. Say, hi, Dr. Shepard. I've been following you on Instagram for a few years. Your life seems to be ideal. You work out regularly. You're often at the movies. You cook great food. You're around friends and family often. How do you manage and juggle it all? Well, thank you for that question. What I will say is, as we are aware, social media is always just a snapshot of people's lives, and usually it's kind of the best of reels, right? But I will say, in general, I do believe I do live a pretty charmed, comfortable life, and it is something that I have worked hard for. So, for instance, as I have talked to my dad about this at times, because he's like, you could be doing more, and I'm like, I could be doing more, right? But I don't work so that I can just work. I work to live. So I purposely, right, I chose a profession and I chose a particular school to work at that allows me a lot of freedom and flexibility, right? So my summers are off. Now I do choose to teach in the summer, but I teach online, so that allows me to travel. I teach on campus 2 days a week. Back when I first started, right, sometimes I had 12-hour days. So I'd be on campus from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. with different courses, teaching 4 courses sometimes back to back, and then long break, then back to back or whatever. And I'd be dog tired, but then I would always have, right, I haven't worked a Friday. I haven't taught on a Friday since grad school, right? So almost 10 years, I haven't worked on a Friday. So I've always had 3 or 4 day weekends. And that's by design. So for 3 days, I'll put in the work. And of course, I'll be available on email and we'll be grading. But I work 3 days a week really strongly. And then it allows me the flexibility and freedom for the other 4. And so, yes, I go to the gym frequently. Before I turned 30, my dad was like, things change after 30. He was like, if you start getting stiff, you might stay stiff, right? So you work out, like get a little more quote unquote fit or healthy and do that, right? And so I took that to heart, right? Someone who has been through it, right? I don't know what 30 plus, 40 plus feels like. I do that. And so I was remarking even the other day to a friend that, like, I really don't have any. I know some people in my age range are starting to complain about back issues or soreness, stuff like that. And I don't have that because I go to the gym. But when I go to the gym, right, I go and I do certain machines, but there's not a goal in mind, right? So I've had people DM me sometimes with Ask Anything, like, I see you're in the gym, like, what are your goals? And I was like, well, my goal is just to stay active, because as a professor, yes, I don't sit and lecture, right? I walk around, but when I'm grading, when I'm doing kind of the majority of my job, it's sedentary. So I want to make sure that I'm active. And so that's the part of making sure I'm in the gym or going for a run on my treadmill now that I have my treadmill back. Shout out to that. And then I purposely, I love movies. I have the AMC A-list, so it's not as expensive to go, right? I think I pay $25 a month. I can see up to 4 movies a week. So I prioritize the things that I like. So I figured out, well, what can I do that will hopefully fund the lifestyle that I want to live, and how can I live it? Now, could I make more money, and do I want to make more money? Of course, I think anybody would, especially in this economy. But I've definitely prioritized certain things and have then built a life around that. So I would say, kind of do a big picture. What do you want your life to look like? Try and find some models and talk to people and figure out how they built their model so they could live that type of life, and then go for it. I also divested from kind of other people's expectations or opinions, right? I was a high achieving child and young adult. I graduated high school early. I graduated college early. I even finished my PhD pretty early, right? There's a whole nother story about that. So, I could be maybe at an R1 institution, bending over backwards, doing a whole bunch of research and doing all this stuff, but ultimately that wouldn't fulfill me and what I want. Now, would it look great to other people? Sure. But what I'm doing feels amazing and allows me to have space to foster really meaningful and deep connections. So, for instance, we were talking about, weak ties. I don't have any weak ties with the people I consider my closest friends. People I can consider my closest friends, I talk to usually every week, sometimes multiple times a week, oftentimes hours on end each week. The average person doesn't have that time, but I do because I have built that into my life. So I would say that's kind of what I've done, and hopefully that can serve as maybe a starting point for you. But thank you all for listening to Off the Data Provided. This wraps up our first year of the podcast. I know a lot of my students had wanted me to do this, and I've enjoyed doing it. So I look forward to hearing and speaking with you all in the new year. And I hope that this podcast has been helpful for all of you that have been listening for the first year. And hopefully it will continue to help you think about, explore, foster, and change your relationship with interpersonal communication, and hopefully for the better, right? The goal is always to make us all more ethical and effective with our communication. So until next time, Happy New Year, and I will see you all in 2027.